Apache versus Mexico, the most deadly frontier war in Americas. Welcome to Native Legends and History Stories. Today, we're diving into one of the most brutal and long-lasting conflicts in North American history, a war that would span centuries and leave an indelible mark on both Apache and Mexican societies. If you're interested in Native American history and the untold stories of the American Southwest, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell. The Spanish period, First Blood, 1600s, 1821. When Spanish colonizers first encountered the Apache in the 1600s, they found themselves face to face with one of the most formidable warrior societies in North America. The Apache, masters of their harsh desert environment, were not a people to be easily subjugated. While other tribes might have bent to Spanish rule, the Apache stood their ground. The conflict began with a fundamental clash of cultures. The Spanish arrived with their system of missions and presidios, military outposts, attempting to establish control over the region. They expected the Apache, like other indigenous peoples, to settle into their system of colonial governance. But the Apache were different. They were semi-nomadic raiders and hunters, not farmers or settlers. Their response to Spanish attempts at control was swift and decisive. They began raiding Spanish settlements. These raids weren't random acts of violence. The Apache had perfected the art of lightning-quick attacks, targeting Spanish resources: horses, cattle, weapons, and supplies. Each successful raid not only provided necessary resources, but also demonstrated the Apache's superiority in their traditional lands. The Spanish settlements, with their fixed locations and valuable concentrations of goods, were perfect targets for Apache raids. By the late 1700s, the Spanish colonial authorities had reached their breaking point with the Apache raids. In a strategic move that would drastically alter the power dynamics of the Southwest, they formed an unlikely alliance with the Comanche, longtime enemies of the Apache. This alliance wasn't merely a temporary military arrangement. It was a calculated attempt at Apache extermination. The Spanish-Comanche alliance proved devastatingly effective. The Comanche, themselves master horsemen and warriors of the plains, brought intimate knowledge of Apache tactics and territory. Combined with Spanish military might, weaponry, and organizational structure, they created a formidable fighting force that the Apache had never encountered before. The campaign against the Apache was relentless. Caught between the Comanche's superior mobility and knowledge of the terrain, and the Spanish military's firepower and numbers, the Apache found themselves in an unprecedented situation. For the first time, they were facing enemies who could match their guerrilla warfare tactics, while also bringing overwhelming force to bear. The results were catastrophic for the Apache. Unable to maintain their dominance of the plains, they were forced to retreat into the mountainous regions. These mountains, while providing some safety, were far less suitable for their traditional way of life. The rugged terrain made it harder to maintain their horse herds, and the resources were more scarce than on the plains they had previously controlled. By the 1790s, the combination of military pressure and resource deprivation had achieved what neither the Spanish nor the Comanche could do alone: the near-complete cessation of Apache raids. The once proud raiders of the plains were now largely confined to the mountains, their ability to conduct large-scale operations severely curtailed. This period marked a crucial turning point in Apache history. Their forced retreat to the mountains wasn't just a military defeat. It represented a fundamental disruption of their traditional lifestyle. The Apache, who had once roamed freely across vast territories, found their world literally and figuratively shrinking. Thousands of Apache, facing the stark choice between starvation in the mountains or surrender, chose the latter, making their way to the Spanish presidios. The success of the Spanish-Comanche alliance demonstrated a harsh truth. Even the mighty Apache could be subdued with enough pressure and the right combination of forces. However, this victory would prove to be less permanent than either the Spanish or Comanche anticipated. The Apache's spirit remained unbroken, and their adaptation to mountain warfare would prove crucial in the conflicts to come. Having effectively subdued the Apache through military force, the Spanish colonial administration implemented what appeared to be a more humane approach, a peace policy that would fundamentally reshape Apache society. The strategy was simple but effective. Keep the Apache fed, keep them close, and gradually integrate them into Spanish colonial life. The cornerstone of this policy was the establishment of a ration system. The Spanish authorities began regularly supplying food to Apache groups living near their presidios. This wasn't mere charity, it was a calculated move to create dependency. By providing these rations, the Spanish hoped to prevent the Apache from returning to their raiding lifestyle. They understood a basic truth. A fed Apache was less likely to raid than a hungry one. The Spanish opened their presidios to Apache settlement, allowing them to establish communities just outside these military outposts. These settlements served multiple purposes. They kept the Apache under close surveillance, provided a buffer zone between Spanish towns and hostile tribes, and facilitated the gradual process of cultural assimilation. The Apache, who had once roamed freely across vast territories, were now living in fixed locations under Spanish oversight. Education became another tool of assimilation. Young Apache were brought into Spanish schools, where they learned the Spanish language, customs, and Catholic doctrine. This education system was particularly effective with the children of Apache leaders, creating a generation that straddled two worlds. They understood both Apache traditions and Spanish colonial society. The results of this policy were significant. Many Apache, particularly those from younger generations, began adopting Spanish names, a visible sign of cultural transformation. Catholic baptisms became increasingly common, though the depth of religious conversion varied widely. The Spanish system of governance, once alien to Apache society, became more familiar through daily interaction and necessity. This period of relative peace lasted until 1821, when Mexico gained independence from Spain. During these years, many Apache lived in what appeared to be stable communities around the presidios. They engaged in trade with Spanish settlers, attended Spanish schools, and participated in local economic activities. Some even began practicing limited agriculture, though this was never fully embraced by most Apache. However, this stability was built on a fragile foundation, the continuous supply of food rations. The Apache had not fundamentally changed their views on farming or settled life. They were hunters and raiders by tradition and inclination, not farmers. They accepted Spanish oversight, not out of conviction, but out of necessity. Their compliance was directly tied to the regular arrival of food supplies from Spanish authorities. This period of peace would later prove crucial in understanding the subsequent explosion of violence between Apache and Mexicans. The Spanish had created a system that appeared stable but required constant maintenance in the form of food supplies and other resources. When these supplies were later disrupted under Mexican rule, the consequences would be severe and long-lasting. Early Mexican period and power transition. 1821 marked a pivotal year in the Southwest, as Mexico finally gained its independence from Spain after a decade-long revolution. The newly formed Mexican government inherited not just territory, but also the complex relationship with the Apache that the Spanish had carefully maintained through their system of food rations and controlled settlements. The initial transition appeared smooth on the surface. The Mexican authorities, displaying political acumen, recognized the importance of maintaining the Spanish system of Apache control. They understood that the relative peace of the previous decades hinged on one crucial factor: keeping the Apache fed and settled near the presidios. Mexican officials maintained the same presidio system established by the Spanish. The military outposts continued to serve as centers of distribution for Apache rations, and the Apache communities remained in their settlements nearby. This continuity was crucial. Any disruption in the food supply could potentially trigger a return to raiding. However, the new Mexican government faced significant challenges from the start. Unlike the Spanish Empire, with its vast resources, Mexico was a young nation that had just emerged from a costly war of independence. The burden of maintaining the Apache ration system was substantial, requiring regular allocation of food supplies, resources, and military personnel to manage distribution. The Mexican authorities initially attempted to match Spanish levels of support for the Apache settlements. They continued providing basic necessities, corn, meat, and other foodstuffs that had become essential to the Apache communities living near the presidios. But maintaining this system proved increasingly difficult as Mexico struggled to establish itself as a nation. The new Mexican administration worked to sustain the established system through the 1820s. The presidios maintained their dual role as military outposts and distribution centers, with Mexican soldiers replacing Spanish troops in managing Apache relations. The Apache communities, numbering in the thousands, continued their settlement patterns around the presidios during these years. While accepting Mexican authority and rations, they maintained their traditional social structure under their own leaders. The trade between Apache settlements and Mexican towns occurred regularly, though the Apache showed little interest in adopting agricultural practices, maintaining their preference for hunting when possible. The first signs of strain in the Mexican-Apache relationship emerged in the early 1830s, when Mexico's post-revolutionary economy began to falter. The decade-long war for independence had depleted the national treasury, destroyed vital infrastructure, and disrupted traditional trade routes. The new nation struggled to maintain basic governmental functions, let alone support the expensive system of Apache rations. The economic crisis hit the northern territories particularly hard. By 1831, supplies to the Apache settlements became irregular. The once reliable distribution of corn and meat dwindled to sporadic deliveries, often providing only a fraction of the previous quantities. In 1832, the Mexican government began systematically reducing subsidies to Apache settlements. The authorities expected the Apache to supplement their reduced rations through farming, as their agreements called for them to provide for their own subsistence outside the presidios. This expectation revealed a fundamental misunderstanding of Apache culture. They were hunters and raiders, not farmers. Most Apache had never fully embraced agriculture during their years of settlement. As food became scarce, the first Apache bands began leaving their settlements near the presidios. The exodus started slowly, a few families at first, then entire groups. They moved back into the mountains and plains, returning to their traditional territories. The semi-nomadic lifestyle that had been suppressed for decades quickly re-emerged. The return to their ancestral lands brought an inevitable resumption of raiding. Initially, these raids focused on immediate needs: cattle, horses, food supplies. The Apache targeted isolated Mexican ranches and small settlements, taking what they needed to survive. These early raids were selective and primarily aimed at acquiring resources rather than inflicting casualties. However, the situation deteriorated rapidly. As more Apache bands left the presidios, the frequency and scale of raids increased. Mexican settlements that had grown accustomed to peace found themselves once again under threat. Cattle herds disappeared overnight. Supply wagons were ambushed, and isolated farms were abandoned. The Apaches' expert knowledge of the terrain made these raids devastatingly effective. They could strike quickly, take what they needed, and vanish into the vast wilderness before Mexican forces could respond. Their intimate familiarity with the mountains and deserts gave them an insurmountable advantage in these hit-and-run operations. By 1833, the carefully maintained peace of the previous decades had completely unraveled. The Apache had returned to their traditional territories and hunting grounds, while Mexican settlements retreated behind the walls of their presidios. The stage was set for a new and more violent phase of the conflict, as both sides abandoned the pretense of peaceful coexistence. Escalation of conflict. Mexican response. By 1833, the Mexican government took drastic measures to combat the growing Apache threat. The state governments of Chihuahua and Sonora, bearing the brunt of Apache raids, mobilized all available resources for defense. State officials took an unprecedented step, voluntarily reducing their own salaries to fund military operations against the Apache. The military response began with a substantial increase in troop deployment to the northern territories. Additional soldiers were stationed at presidios, and new defensive positions were established along major trade routes. In a significant policy shift, the Mexican authorities ordered all civilian men in threatened areas to carry weapons at all times and join local defense forces. These civilian militias became an essential part of Mexico's defense strategy. Each town formed its own defense unit, with men required to participate in regular patrols and respond immediately to Apache raids. The distinction between soldier and civilian began to blur in the northern territories as every able-bodied man became part of the war effort. In 1835, the Mexican government introduced its most controversial measure, the scalp bounty system. The price was set at 100 pesos for the scalp of an adult male Apache. This policy marked a dramatic escalation in the conflict's brutality. The bounty system didn't discriminate between hostile and peaceful Apache. Any Apache scalp would earn the reward. The treatment of captured Apache women and children reflected this heightened brutality. Rather than being killed for bounties, they were captured and sold into slavery. The practice became so widespread that regular slave markets emerged in some northern Mexican towns. The Apache who were caught often faced two options: death for the men, slavery for the women and children. Some captured Apache women managed to escape their captors, demonstrating remarkable resilience. One such woman, Francesca, survived not only her escape, but also a violent encounter with a mountain lion, which she killed with a knife, despite suffering severe injuries. She later became one of Geronimo's wives. The Mexican authorities also employed psychological warfare tactics. They began storing Apache scalps in public places, displaying them as warnings to other Apache and as proof for bounty payments. This practice, intended to intimidate, instead fueled a cycle of revenge that would span generations. The Apache, far from being intimidated, adapted to these escalating threats. They began moving in smaller groups, making it harder for Mexican forces to track them. Their raids became more calculated and deadly, as they now saw every Mexican as a potential threat. The conflict had transformed from a struggle over resources into a brutal war of survival. The Santa Rita incident of 1837 marked a turning point in the escalating conflict. Near the copper mines of Santa Rita, John Johnson's group discovered an Apache band of 50 warriors, led by Juan Jose. The choice of Juan Jose as their target was particularly significant. He was one of the Apache leaders, educated in Mexican schools outside the presidios, a man who understood both Apache and Mexican ways. Johnson devised a treacherous plan. Feigning friendship, he invited the Apache into his camp. The bait was simple but effective: promises of flour and liquor, basic provisions that had become scarce for the Apache since the reduction of Mexican rations. Juan Jose, with his experience in Mexican society, likely saw this as an opportunity for peaceful trade. The Apache entered Johnson's camp under the pretense of peace and celebration. As they gathered to feast and drink the offered liquor, Mexican soldiers quietly surrounded them. The Apache, focused on the promised provisions, remained unaware of the troops taking strategic positions around the camp. Without warning or provocation, the trap was sprung. A cannon opened fire on the gathered Apache, followed immediately by coordinated rifle volleys from the surrounding soldiers. The surprise was complete. The Apache had no chance to mount an effective defense or escape. The feast turned into a massacre. In the chaos and carnage that followed, Juan Jose fell among the first victims. By the time the gunfire ceased, he and 20 other Apache warriors lay dead. The attack was brutally efficient. Nearly half of the Apache band was eliminated in a matter of minutes. The significance of alcohol in this betrayal was not lost on the Apache. The use of liquor to lower their guard would become a recurring theme in Mexican tactics. This lesson was so deeply learned that in subsequent years, Apache leaders would only permit half their warriors to drink during any celebration, ensuring that part of their force remained alert and ready for such treachery. The death of Juan Jose brought forth a new Apache leader, Mangus Coloradas, who would prove to be one of the most formidable war chiefs in Apache history. His response to the Santa Rita massacre was swift and devastating, ushering in a new era of intensified warfare. Under Mangus Coloradas's leadership, the Apache struck back at Santa Rita with calculated precision. In their first major retaliatory strike, they targeted a group of 22 fur trappers near the copper mines. The attack was not a simple raid. It was a message. Every trapper was killed, their bodies left as a stark warning of Apache vengeance. But Mangus Coloradas wasn't finished. When word spread of the Apache attacks, panic gripped the local Mexican population. 300 to 400 settlers fled their homes, forming a large convoy, seeking safety at the Llanos Presidio. The Apache, under Mangus Coloradas's command, tracked this convoy of refugees. The attack on the fleeing settlers demonstrated Mangus Coloradas's tactical brilliance. The Apache warriors intercepted the convoy before it could reach the safety of Llanos. In the ensuing attack, the majority of the settlers were either killed or captured. Those who survived brought tales of Apache ferocity that spread fear throughout the northern territories. The impact on Santa Rita was immediate and long-lasting. The copper mines, once a center of economic activity in the region, fell silent. No one dared to work them. For the next 35 years, the mines remained closed, a testament to the effectiveness of Apache retaliation. The effects rippled beyond Santa Rita. Under Mangus Coloradas's leadership, Apache attacks grew more coordinated and deadly. Mexican settlements that had previously felt secure behind their walls now lived in constant fear. Trade routes that had been relatively safe became deadly gambles. The Apache had transformed from raiders seeking resources into warriors waging a campaign of vengeance. Mangus Coloradas understood the power of terror as a weapon. Each successful attack not only acquired resources for his people, but also sent a message. The Apache would not be subdued through treachery. His campaigns effectively closed down large swaths of territory to Mexican settlement, creating a no-man's land where only the Apache dared to venture. The era of Mangus Coloradas marked the point where the conflict between Mexico and the Apache transcended mere territorial disputes or resource raids. It became a blood feud, where each act of violence demanded retaliation, creating a cycle that would persist for generations. Geronimo's personal vendetta. In the summer of 1858, while Geronimo and other Apache men were trading in a nearby town, 400 Mexican soldiers discovered their rancheria outside Llanos. The soldiers had tracked the Apache settlement and deliberately timed their attack when the warriors were absent. The Mexican force launched a surprise assault on the camp. The attack was swift and brutal. Among the dead were Geronimo's young wife, his mother, and his 3 children. The soldiers killed dozens of other Apache civilians in the settlement, primarily women, children, and elderly, who had remained behind while the men were trading. By the time Geronimo and the other warriors returned to the rancheria, the Mexican soldiers had already departed. They found their homes destroyed and their families massacred. This was not an isolated incident. It was part of Mexico's broader military campaign against the Apache during this period, targeting not just warriors, but entire communities. After the Llanos massacre, Geronimo's pattern of warfare changed markedly. Before 1858, like most Apache warriors, he participated in raids primarily focused on acquiring horses, cattle, and supplies. After the massacre, he began actively seeking out Mexican military targets. He started wearing a distinctive medicine shirt in battle, a leather garment decorated with symbols that became well known to Mexican soldiers. The transformation of his tactics was evident in his first raids after the massacre. Where Apache raids typically involved quick strikes to capture resources, Geronimo began conducting longer campaigns deep into Mexican territory. He would often remain in Mexican territory for weeks at a time, a dangerous strategy that few other Apache leaders would risk. From 1858 to 1886, Geronimo led numerous raids into Mexico. His name became so notorious that Mexican soldiers reported hearing their comrades curse Geronimo during battles. In his own words, recorded later in his autobiography, "I have killed many Mexicans. I do not know how many, for frequently I did not count them. Some of them were not worth counting." The impact of Geronimo's campaigns was substantial. His raids forced many Mexican settlements to be abandoned, disrupted trade routes, and required Mexico to maintain large military forces in the northern territories. The Mexican government eventually committed several thousand troops, specifically to track down Geronimo's band, a significant allocation of military resources for pursuing a single Apache leader. In 1859, Geronimo orchestrated one of his most audacious attacks near Arizpe, a former state capital of Sonora that had already suffered from years of Apache raids. Raising a war party, he led them deep into Sonora territory. The initial phase of his plan involved sending 8 warriors toward the town. These warriors executed any men they encountered and captured women and children, bringing them back to the Apache camp. This was not a typical Apache raid. It was bait for a larger trap. When the townspeople discovered the killings and kidnappings, Geronimo knew they would send troops into the mountains to pursue the Apache. His warriors posted sentinels after the initial attack and, in Geronimo's own words, rested quietly all night. For we expected heavy work the next day. The bodies were discovered early the next morning. By 10 a.m., the Mexican response was exactly as Geronimo had anticipated. 2 columns of infantry, backed by a cavalry unit, moved into the mountains in pursuit of the Apache. Geronimo claimed he recognized the cavalry as the same unit present during the massacre of his family the year before. Breaking from traditional Apache hit-and-run tactics, Geronimo chose to meet the Mexican forces head-on. The battle lasted 2 hours, with intense fighting across the mountainous terrain. At one point, Geronimo and 4 other warriors found themselves surrounded in a field, their arrows spent and spears broken. Armed only with a knife, Geronimo darted between the Mexican soldiers, evading their weapons. He watched as a Mexican soldier ran his companion through with a saber. In the ensuing hand-to-hand combat, Geronimo wrestled with the soldier, both men locked in a deadly struggle. The soldier with his saber, Geronimo with his knife. As they fell to the ground, Geronimo gained the upper hand and delivered the fatal blow. Exhausted from the fight, Geronimo lay on the ground, covered in the blood of his enemies. He picked up the fallen soldier's saber and knelt, surveying a field littered with Mexican casualties. The surviving Apache warriors, who witnessed the scene, broke the silence with their war whoops. Before departing the battlefield, Geronimo ordered his men to scalp the dead, a practice the Apache had learned from the Mexicans' own bounty system. The Battle of Arizpe demonstrated a significant shift in Apache warfare. Instead of the traditional strategy of quick raids, followed by rapid retreat, Geronimo had chosen to engage in direct combat. The success of this battle led to similar tactics in future engagements, though such direct confrontations remained rare in Apache military strategy. Between 1859 and 1861, Geronimo intensified his campaign against Mexico, leading 4 major war parties into Mexican territory. These expeditions were notable for their audacity and frequency. 4 major incursions in just 2 years marked an unusually aggressive pace for Apache raids. Planning these attacks required significant effort on Geronimo's part. Each war party was formed through voluntary participation. He had to convince other Apache warriors to join his campaigns. This wasn't always easy, as his reputation for reckless aggression made many warriors hesitant to follow him. The Apache population was too small to sustain heavy casualties, and Geronimo's tactics often led to higher death rates than traditional Apache warfare. Despite these challenges, Geronimo's raids during this period achieved their goal of spreading terror through the Mexican territories. His name became so notorious that during battles, Apache warriors reported hearing Mexican soldiers curse Geronimo. His reputation grew to such an extent that even his own people began criticizing him, not for his effectiveness, but for the cost in Apache lives his aggressive tactics demanded. The criticism from his own people was significant. The Apache's limited population meant they couldn't afford to lose warriors in unnecessary confrontations. Traditional Apache warfare emphasized minimal casualties through hit-and-run tactics. But Geronimo's hatred for Mexicans often led him to engage in riskier, more direct confrontations. His rage would get Apache warriors killed, a fact that didn't earn him many friends among his own people. Despite facing internal opposition to his methods, Geronimo would have conducted more raids during this period if he could have gathered enough volunteers. His personal vendetta against Mexico remained undiminished, but he was constrained by the need to convince others to join his war parties. The Mexican military persistently hunted Apache bands through the wilderness, though finding them proved nearly impossible. They did achieve some crucial victories, most notably at the Battle of Tres Castillo in 1880, where they tracked down and killed Chief Vittorio. This loss prompted many remaining Apache to look to Geronimo for leadership, despite him never holding the position of chief. In the mid-1880s, during his famous escape from the San Carlos Reservation, Geronimo continued leading raids into Mexican territory. The Apache's ability to strike and vanish made them such a significant threat that the Mexican government supplied several thousand troops to aid the Americans in capture operations. Eventually, like most Apache, Geronimo surrendered to American forces. He was moved eastward, finally settling at Fort Sill in Oklahoma. Even in his old age, his hatred for Mexico remained undiminished. In his autobiography, he stated plainly, "I am old now, and shall never go on the warpath again. But if I were young and followed the warpath, it would lead into Old Mexico." The aftermath. The scale of violence in the Apache-Mexican conflict was staggering. Between 1830 and 1840, the death toll in just 2 Mexican states, Chihuahua and Sonora, reached approximately 6,000 Mexicans. For the Apache, whose total population numbered only a few thousand, the loss of 1,000 warriors represented a devastating demographic blow. Cultural practices changed dramatically through the conflict. The Apache, who historically had no tradition of scalping, learned this practice directly from Mexico's bounty system. During a heated confrontation with the governor of Chihuahua, Chief Woe exposed this brutal irony. The governor had scaled back bounty payments in the 1850s. When a disturbing truth emerged, bounty hunters could not distinguish between Apache and Mexican scalps, leading to payments for Mexican victims. This practice highlighted the savage nature the conflict had taken, where traditional rules of warfare had been abandoned by both sides. The territorial losses proved catastrophic for the Apache way of life. Their ancestral lands, once spanning vast regions across what is now the American Southwest and northern Mexico, were systematically taken. The mountains and valleys where they had hunted and established seasonal camps became Mexican settlements and American homesteads. The final blow came with forced relocation to reservations, confined spaces that made their traditional nomadic lifestyle impossible. The long-term consequences rippled through generations. The Apache social structure, built around mobility and raiding, collapsed within the reservation system. Their complex network of familial bands and leadership systems fractured. The economic foundation of their society, raiding for resources and trading, vanished completely. They became dependent on government rations, a bitter reality for a people who had once sustained themselves through skill and strength. The conflict's impact extended far beyond its official end. Apache children born on reservations never experienced their traditional way of life. The relationship between the Apache and government authorities remained strained for decades, marked by deep distrust born from years of broken promises and violence. Some Apache, known as the Broncos, refused to accept reservation life well into the 1920s and 30s, choosing instead to maintain their freedom in the mountains between Mexico and the United States. Want to learn more about the warriors who shaped the American frontier? Hit subscribe and join us for more stories from Native American history.